Hello everyone, welcome to Olsen Cafe. In this lesson, let's solve simple trigo equations using three key steps. And I will say this is the most fundamentals. Ensure that you understand the theory behind and the concept behind. And if you are able to do this, right, this will help you to solve more complex questions later on. So let's begin. All right, before we dive into solving trigo equations, let's go through some of the prerequisites that you must know. Yeah, so the most basic that all of you must be able to do is to find angle in the first quadrant. In this case, we usually use alpha to represent the basic angle, or in some cases, some of you use the term as reference angle. So in second quadrant, it's simply 180 minus alpha. Third quadrant is 180 plus alpha. And the fourth quadrant is 360 degrees minus alpha. So I was mentioning the quadrants, right? So basically quadrants are being represented by what I call this ASTC diagram. So I like to call it all science teacher crazy. So that will give you the order of the quadrant. But in some cases, some of you may like to use add sugar to coffee. Yeah, so this ASTC quadrant is very useful to help you to solve trigo equations later on, but just to make sure that you need to know how to find basic angle. So just want to highlight that for basic angle, right? So basic angle, it is always measured from the horizontal line. So in this case, this will be your first quadrant. And then for second quadrant, the basic angle is actually again measured from the horizontal axis. Likewise, for third quadrant, it will be here, and then the fourth quadrant, this is where you find basic angle. So this is a part whereby a lot of students actually misunderstood, all right, and then that caused them to make error in the process of solving equations. So just make sure that you are familiar with what is basic angle. Now, the other basic knowledge that all of you must be familiar with, it will be the trigo ratio of special angles. Yeah, so in this case, in this table, yeah, we have already, it shows the relationship of the various trigo ratio of respective special angles. So in this case, the special angles we are referring to will be 30 degrees, or if it's in radian mode, it will be pi over 6, and then 45 degrees and 60 degrees. So this is a table whereby you need to be very familiar with, yeah, and usually come with this, right? In some cases in the question, they might ask you, or find in exact values, or leave the answer in exact values. So you will need to know exactly what does that mean. Yeah, so when we say exact value, simply means at the final answer, you are expected to leave the answer in terms of pi. So this will be the last thing that you need to know for this lesson here. So you must know the relationship between tangent and sine and cosine. Similarly for cotangent, secant and cosecant. I will say this is something that is so basic that you must know them well, because you will definitely need to apply them when solving trigo equations. So with this, let's start. So in this lesson, I've prepared three equations for us to solve together. So let's move on to the very first one. So over here, what you see is that we have two functions. We have sine y and cosine y. Now, bear in mind, when you solve trigo equations, right, there should not be more than one function. Yeah. So over here, there are already two functions. So therefore, what we need to do is we will need to simplify them first before we can start to solve. Yeah, so how can we solve this? How can we simplify? So we already know the relationship between tangent and sine and cosine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to manipulate this equation until I can get tangent. So I can easily do this by rearranging the equation. So I moved cosine to the right hand side, and from here I am able to get sine y divided by cosine y equals to negative 7 over 3. So with this, I'm able to get tangent y. So I am having one function now, so which means I am ready to solve the equations. Now, to solve the equation, as I mentioned earlier on at the introduction, yeah, I'm going to use 3 key steps. So make sure you are familiar with these 3 key steps. So these three key steps are namely, number 1, identify the quadrants. Then step 2, you find the basic angle, which I will demo to you how I am going to do that. And then once the first 2 steps are done, then we are ready to find all the angles in the identified quadrants. So over here, it's good to also know that step 1 and step 2, right? It doesn't really matter that you must follow this step. You can always switch around and to find the basic angle first before you identify the quadrant. It is perfectly fine. Yeah, so just make sure that these 2 steps must be carried out before you move on to step 3. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move on to step number 1. So step 1 involve identify the quadrants. So as I mentioned earlier on, so we need to know these 4 quadrants very well. So right now you can see that tangent is negative, right? Tangent has a negative value. So with tangent negative value, we take a look at the quadrant, right? I know that it will be in the second quadrant, and the other one, it will be in the fourth quadrant. So with this, all right, I write down this statement, angle Y, right, is either in the second quadrant or the fourth quadrant. So once this is done, we are ready to move on to find the basic angle. Now, to find the basic angle, what I just want to highlight is that, this I wrote down here, we ignore the sign. Yeah, so because tangent is negative, right? So be very sure that you do not include this negative in the calculator, because otherwise what the calculator value will give it to you is actually the principal value, which I hope to cover in one of my lessons, all right? The difference between basic angle and principal values. Yeah, so over here we need to find basic angle or reference angle, not principal value. Yeah, so if you have a calculator with you, you can work it out together with me. So you simply just do a second function, tangent, you include 7/3, and this you should get the basic angle as 66.80 degrees. So this is your basic angle. Now basic angle is done, so we are ready to move on to the third step, that is how to find all the angles in the identified quadrant. So since tangent is negative, right, how can we find angle in the second quadrant? All right, if you can recall, in the second quadrant, which I mentioned earlier on, it is 180 degrees minus alpha, which is 66.8, or the angle in the fourth quadrant, it is simply 360 degrees minus or 66.8 degrees. So with this, we are ready to move on, all right, and to get the final answer, which is 113.2 degrees and 292.2 degrees. And do bear in mind, for any answers, right, the final answers for angle, it is always rounded up to 1 decimal place. So let's take a look at the second example here. So in this case, we are going to solve 3 cosine y equals to 2 secant y. So again, the equation has 2 functions. So with 2 functions, so therefore we will need to simplify until we only get 1 function. Yeah. So what we have here is we need to know the relationship between secant and cosine. Yeah, so we know that secant is actually equals to 1 over cosine. So therefore, knowing this, I simplify, I will be able to get cosine square is equals to 2/3. Now, why I pick this example is simply because in the process of simplifying, right, a lot of students actually tend to neglect the plus and minus sign here. So please remember, whenever there is a square term, all right, when you take a square root, all right, there should be a plus and minus sign included. So do take note. So with this, right, we are going to apply the 3 key steps, right, over here to solve these equations. So the very first step is to identify the quadrants. So over here, the quadrants that we have, it covers orange, first, second, third, and fourth. So I would like to ask you to think why the angle Y is actually in all the 4 quadrants. So if you do a bit of the thinking, right, let's go through the ASTC. So when we go through ASTC, you will notice that when cosine is positive, so when cosine is positive, it will be in the first and the fourth quadrant, right? But when cosine is negative, then it will be in the second or the third quadrant. So that is the reason why the angle will be in all the 4 quadrants. Yeah. So with this, we move on to finding the basic angle. So to find the basic angle, like I mentioned, we ignore the sign. So basically, you just need to key in 2/3, right, in the calculator. So with this, you should be able to find basic angle as 35.264. All right, so over here in this value is correct to 3 decimal places. All right, in many cases, if you can round it off to 2 decimal places, it is more than enough, right? It's sufficient. So with this, then we are ready to move on to the third step, that is to find all the angles in the identified quadrant. So to do that, I will need to find out the angles in the first, second, third, or fourth quadrant. Yeah, so with this, I'm able to work out, all right, in the first quadrant as 35.264, second quadrant, I have to take 180 minus of alpha, then third quadrant, 180 plus alpha, and the fourth quadrant, 360 degrees minus alpha. Yeah, so with this, I can easily work out the final answer correct to 1 decimal place. So therefore, I have the answer in first, second, third, and the fourth quadrant. Yeah, so this would be our second example. So let's move on to the last equation that we are going to solve in this lesson. Okay, so we are into our last example in this lesson. So over here, in this case, we see that in this equation, there are 2 functions again. Yeah, so with 2 functions again, we have to simplify. So a lot of students, what they do is they tend to jump in and just cancel away the sine x, right? Which is so-called divide throughout both sides by sine x, which I strongly discourage. Yeah, so that is a wrong thing to do. So instead, what should we do then? Yeah, so in this case, if you can see from my example here, all right, I simplify by bringing sine x to the left-hand side. So what I do is at this point, I simply just factorize out the sine x. So I'll get sine x times 2 cosine x minus 1. So with this, right, if you recall, if you have cancel away the sine x, what you notice that you will actually omit the answers when sine x is equals to 0. So that's a wrong thing to do. So therefore, I will want to again highlight that whenever you come across questions like this, right, when you see same function on the left and the right right side of the equation, never cancel away, all right, or rather divide by the sine x. So use factorization method instead. Yeah, so with this, then I can use zero factor theorem. So with zero factor theorem, I will be able to get sine x equals to 0, or I will have cosine x is equals to half. Yeah, so once I reach this step, then we are ready to solve the equations. So again, we are going to apply the 3 key steps. Yeah, so the first step will be to identify the quadrants. Now let's take a look at sine x equals to 0. Then some of you may ask, how can I solve sine x equals to 0? What exactly, which quadrant is it in? So over here, whenever you have sine x equals to 0 or cosine x equals to 0, or even sine x equals to plus and minus 1 or cosine x equals to plus and minus 1, do pay attention to these equations here. So for this type of equations, right, you need not identify the quadrant. Instead, what I suggest you to do is you have in mind, right, the trigo graph, which I covered in my previous lesson. So in trigo graph, right, this is the basic sine graph. So in basic sine graph, you notice that for sine x is equal to 0, I will have here 0 degrees, 180 degrees, and 360 degrees. Yeah, so over here, this will help us to find the value of x. Yeah, so with this, do take note, theta is in radian mode, right? Because it's given from 0 to 2 pi. So therefore, you should not leave the answer in degree mode. So therefore, by writing in terms of radian mode, so therefore, you know that the angle x will be equals to 0, pi, and 2 pi. So the first set of the answers done for sine x equals to 0. Now we move on to cosine x equals to half. So we apply the method that we had been using earlier on. So that means I will have x equals to first and fourth quadrant because cosine has a positive value. So with this, I'm able to find the basic angle. So basic angle I can get is actually pi over 3 radian. And the final answer, this will be in the first quadrant, therefore is a pi over 3. And then in the fourth quadrant, so fourth quadrant, how do I get this? Is simply 2 pi minus of the basic angle. So the things to take note here is that because theta is in radian mode, all right, and we have special angles involved. So how do I know we have special angle involved? So you can see we have the value half, and we have sine x equals to 0. All right, so you must be able to identify when will you get the special angle. So with this, that is a clue that we strongly encourage you to leave the answer in terms of pi. So I hope, all right, these three equations here give you a basic idea of how to solve simple trigo equations. Like I mentioned earlier on, these are something very basic, something very fundamental. Make sure you understand the concept behind. So with this, if you like the lesson, do remember to subscribe and to like my video. Right, and I will watch and I